In this video, we're going to talk about ecological succession, or more specifically, how communities develop over time. So it's first important to define what succession or ecological succession is. Succession is a change within a community involving a series of species replacements. This is an important concept because communities are not stable, rather that they're very dynamic, meaning that they change frequently. And ecological succession is a way of categorizing that change. And so there are two types of ecological succession. There are primary and there's secondary. And we're going to talk about what each of those mean. But what you can see here is just a general overview of what succession looks like. Just a change within a community involving a series of species replacements. So we start down here with these low grasses moving to shrubs, small trees, all the way up to these very large trees. So eventually you have a dominant species replaced by another, and so forth. Primary succession is succession that occurs or is the formation of soil from exposed rock due to environmental factors like wind, water, or any other abiotic factor. A primary distinction, or a very particular distinction of primary succession, is the fact that it occurs in areas where there's no base soil, meaning that the soil has been completely wiped out. So an example of when primary succession would occur is when a volcano erupts and wipes out all of the living or biotic factors around it, and depleting that area of a soil. When there's no base soil, primary succession is going to occur. And when we talk about primary succession, we're also going to talk about pioneer organisms. And so just like the name kind of implies, a pioneer organism is the organism that is first to inhabit a community. If we're talking about primary succession, wherever you see this exposed rock, which was due to some kind of environmental or natural disaster, typically the pioneer organism is going to be a lichen. And a lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. And then along with those lichens, you will also find things like mosses. And so lichens and mosses are going to pioneer or inhabit this new exposed rock where there's no base soil. Those lichens and mosses are going to allow, or the breakdown of rocks and the lichens and mosses undergoing photosynthesis are going to start building up a soil base again. And so once we have that soil base, thanks to these pioneer organisms, we can now have grasses, herbs, shrubs, tree seedlings, and whatnot start to develop. And then eventually over time, you have these very larger species replacing everything else. So pine trees, white spruce trees. And this is what we would call a climax community. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. So secondary succession is different from primary in that it doesn't occur in an area where there's no base soil. Rather, it occurs in an existing community which has been cleared by some disturbance, but the soil or that base soil is still intact. And so typically an example of this is burning. And so this is actually what happened in Yellowstone National Park in 1988. There was a series of dominant trees in that park, and after a controlled burning, controlled meaning that humans actually induced that burning, that original species was wiped out, and we had a new pioneer species, an intermediate species, and then our final climax community. And so what that means is that a new species replaced that original species that was dominant before the fire. And so the key takeaway is secondary succession occurs when an area has been wiped out by disturbance that still leaves the soil intact. And so it's also just important to talk about some of the science or models behind this. This seems maybe very straightforward, but at the time when these ideas were being presented, it wasn't well studied. And so this guy, Clements, he lived from 1874, 1874 to 1945. He proposed this idea of a climax community, meaning that all communities are want to move towards a very stable community, and that is the climax community. After all those pioneer intermediate species have occurred, that climax community is going to be that stable community, and so all the communities want to move towards that. His hypothesis had multiple parts. The first was that climate is going to determine the type of environment that's formed, or what type of succession is going to occur. So, for example, he explained why coniferous forests were common in the northern hemisphere, and why they weren't found in the southern hemisphere, because climate had an effect on that type of environment. He also suggested that soil conditions affect the results. And kind of combining all this, he came up with this facilitation model. And so this is the model or idea that each species, whether it's a pioneer, intermediate, secondary, intermediate, whatever, facilitates the ability of the new species to arise. And so each species plays a role in allowing the ones to come after it to start colonizing an area. There are a couple different models, and an inhibition model has been proposed, meaning which pretty much says that the colonists or those original species will actually inhibit the growth of other plants until the colonists die or are damaged, whether by a natural disaster or man-made disaster. And also the tolerance model, which just means that different types of plants can colonize the same area. It's not that one of these models is right or wrong, just rather each model will apply in different situations. So it actually turns out that all these models have been well studied in various communities.